Hi, everyone. I'm Blaine Birch, and welcome to Turning Point, Stories and Strategies from the World of Business. And joining me today is a longtime friend and a longtime entrepreneur, Ken Bautista. Thanks, Ken, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Just to give a little bit of background, Ken and I have known each other for, it's got to be
A
close to 20
while.
years.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how long, but it's got to be close to 20 years. And we've been, we've been fortunate to travel all sorts of interesting places all over the world. It's probably 10, 15 years ago, it's starting to date us, and always really interesting stuff. And so I actually, just to get going, Ken, I just wanted to dive into a little bit about how you got started in business. Like, what was your first experience with business?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So my background is actually from education and teaching. So I went to school to be a teacher, and my focus was actually using technology in the classroom. So, I'd always been interested in technology, computers, games, and digital media. And around the time when I was in school, like the web was really, in its sort of first boom of stuff too. And what was really interesting during kind of like my classes is, how do you use technology in the classroom? And, what is this sort of new wave of content, and how do you use this tool for teaching and education? And so that actually sort of led me into development of products and into this world of entrepreneurship and business, because I sort of started my first company during my third or fourth year of university. It was an educational software company, and part of it was just developing these content modules for teachers. And then it became more, and then became schools. And then once I graduated, it was like, hey, let's try out, I could go into the classroom, or I could maybe try out sort of, what the world of entrepreneurship is all about. So that's how I got into it.
So you started making these modules, and it's funny because going back a lot of years, I remember we touched on some educational stuff too, and in my first business, and that could be a real challenge dealing with that whole infrastructure of education. So you were still doing that while you were a student. So were you, was it just you at that time, or did you actually start to build a team at that point?
Yeah,
Or
I think that this is the nice thing about not having like a kind of like a business background at this sort of sense. Is just like I need to build a team, and part of it was actually just finding like one or two other like designers. I knew a little bit of sort of tech, but that I had like a programmer that I could kind of work with, and then we used to just meet on campus to kind of work on projects and stuff.
yeah,
And these are also the days like we would be developing like CD-ROMs, like kind of like physical media too.
yeah.
And so, learning about not only just, we really focused on product. I think that's always sort of been my strength. It was less about kind of creating a business or starting a business or a venture, but really being like, hey, there's a problem that's out there. Let's build a product to, sort of solve that problem. And then see if there's a business that starts to sort of form around that. As I then started to kind of turn it into a business, I actually got my first loan through the Canadian Youth Business Foundation, or as a Futurepreneur. Which is sort of your first kind of take it like writing a business plan, talk about the market, all of these different pieces to be able to get some resources to kind of get things going. And it was a little bit of that process combined with going into a business incubator here in St. Albert, and which was called NABI, which is the Northern Alberta Business Incubator. And it was, my first sort of like just taste around being around other entrepreneurs who weren't all tech focused. There was like construction companies, engineering companies, et cetera, but everyone was sort of like starting a business. And for me, it was just really soaking in, what running a business, entrepreneurship is all about, by just being around other people who are in it, and really learn on the fly in a lot of ways.
So you're actually, like, your first experience from business. Interesting, because I hadn't realized that you had sort of come from that point. And it's a little foreshadowing for later. But you had this opportunity to be in sort of an accelerator environment to talk with other business people and to learn sort of from osmosis and shared experiences.
Yeah, no, totally. And we'll probably talk about startups and entrepreneurship, but I feel that even having come from the education background, one of the things as a teacher is really, not just sort of teaching students, but like creating the environment where they can learn and figure things out, for themselves, next to other people. And when you think about business, like, there's businesses that this is how they work. There's some businesses like that, and then there's other businesses, especially when you're sort of in startup mode, which is you're building something that maybe that someone hasn't done before. So there's not really, a playbook for how that should work necessarily, but you can really learn from what other people are doing, and then just be in an environment where you have the ability to test out different things, learn the hard way, and a lot of times. But then figuring out, how do you just keep getting better and better and starting to sort of like deploy that. And to me, that's what really business is. It's not a sort of like just check all the boxes and then you're there. It's kind of like, it's really about the building process that makes it really interesting.
Yeah. I was thinking about the sort of the process of running a business last week, especially like for those of you listening, wondering when we're talking right now. We're in October of 2020, so it's still right in the depth of COVID. And I just had this. I was talking with someone last week, and I was explaining, entrepreneurship, and somehow in the context of the conversation, I said, well, it's like you're climbing up a kind of a sheer cliff. When you look, and you're like, this is cool. I'm going to just climb this. It's going to be fun. And I've done this as a kid, and because I can really relate to it. And you're climbing and climbing and climbing. And then all of a sudden you look and go, oh man, I think I might be stuck. I'm not sure if I can keep going. But then you look down and realize, well, I'm 40 feet up. The only way to go is up. Like, I've only got one chance here. It's going straight up. But that's so much how entrepreneurship feels, is you don't know what you don't know. And by the time you learn it, you're too far down the road and you can't stop.
Yeah.
You just got to keep
Yeah,
going,
exactly.
right?
Well, and I think that there's also, this idea of like, what does it mean to be an entrepreneur? And, some people will sort of start a business because they want to be their own boss, or they want to sort of, be more in that sort of leadership, sort of management sort of side. And I've always sort of known this about myself, which is I really like the startup period when there's like a lot of uncertainty, because that sort of period of time isn't just about, again, starting like a business. It's about, having enough courage to just try different things, do it more out in the open, which we're able to do today. But I mean, like, back when we were starting like our first stuff, like, internet's not that prevalent. Like the ability to connect with other people and customers is not as easy as we can do it today. If we wanted to create like an e-commerce site, it would cost like 6 figures to build that instead of setting up on Shopify. So it was like all of the tools are sort of like there. So it's really about the mindset of how you want to get something going, and then, creating a venture to be able to go and attack a particular problem that you want to solve.
Yeah. So when you graduated, because you had basically started this business, you graduated with an education degree. Was there even any thought at all of going into education? Was it like, now I'm free to grow my business?
Yeah, I think it was like right up until the end. Like I was interviewing for classroom jobs. Most of my jobs in university too were like, running programs, like public and education programs at like the provincial museum and for the city. So it was very much working with kids, and I think the one thing was, you can kind of try it out, and I can not just kind of fall back into teaching, but if I'm going to do it, I didn't want to start teaching and then always sort of like wonder, could I go and get something kind of going? I was just like, now's the time. I also, my wife's also a teacher. We graduated at the same time too. And so, so she was really supportive in terms of just being able to say, okay, like there's sort of something that's there, go explore that. And which was an interesting for us, as a couple too, because, we were like starting a new company off a first-year teacher salary in this sort of new world of trying to get something going from scratch. So I learned a lot in those really, those initial years for just what it takes to kind of like keep pushing through.
Yeah. And it's that's interesting that out of all, we've had, I think, probably 8 or 9 episodes already now. And this is the first time that anyone has touched on the importance of support at home from a significant other. And it's the same thing with me. When you think about the struggles, the risk, the stress, everything that goes through, it was an interesting, we could do a whole show on that because it's such an interesting little tidbit that you brought up there. But I don't want to really go off track. I found that interesting, and it's a really interesting conversation to have.
Yeah.
So you graduate, you start, kind of into this world of business. Your foundation was in educational materials, digital media. What was our first, where did you feel like you got your first sort of real anchor? Like, you're out of the accelerator and you're on your own and starting to build.
Um, I think when you start to, the first company was up to about 10 people or so. And I had some partners as well. And, it's a really sort of interesting thing when you go from like one or two people to then like staff, and then you have an
Yeah.
office, and then that becomes sort of like first phase of, oh, okay, this is more than just doing kind of projects. Um, the trouble is that there's always this like kind of pressure that like, the signal that you're moving ahead is headcount, getting more space, revenue is growing. And it's just like, and it's there. And, and I think when I remember first starting the initial company, yeah, it was all about kind of educational content. And then we sort of started moving into more of this sort of consulting type of thing, which was, apply this type of thinking, working with larger customers and clients. But then we were building stuff for other people,
Yeah.
or building other people's products. And, but we were growing, right. And so there's this sort of like kind of balance of like, why are we doing this in the first place? Because otherwise are we just like running the business to just pay these bills that we have to sort of like get out there? Or are we putting something out into the world that is interesting, that we, are learning from as well? So I think that first company, because it was kind of a mishmash of stuff, it was an interactive agency, we had some of our own projects, and then we're doing games and just all sorts of stuff. I think what I really sort of learned from that first thing was just how to start building a team of people, because a lot of the team that I had sort of like assembled for that time have actually kind of gone off and worked for some really great companies. Like, some are at like Apple, some are at like, just like, and in good roles. And there was this sort of point in time when we were just this little kind of like squad, just making some stuff. Weren't trying to be an agency, weren't trying to sort of be a business. We were just, but that you start to learn that can only go so far. And then you have to try to figure out like, well, what is the next move from there?
Yeah. So you're, one of the things I kind of wanted to explore a little bit with you was you started to veer kind of away from this agency world and really started to become a driver in this entrepreneur space. And and it's interesting because you talked about your educational background. And so not just like being able to help and teach and train entrepreneurs. And where did that transition happen? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I think it kind of goes back to the whole like embracing what kind of entrepreneur you want to be. Like, for example, like, I'll talk with like a lot of other like founders when they're kind of creating companies. And, when you're the CEO of the company, you kind of pick what lane type of CEO you're going to be, right? And some people are really great at like sales and marketing. Some are like really great operators. Some are like product people, and you kind of have to be all of those too, as sort of like as creating the company. But, I started to kind of get away from trying to sort of like run a business and going back to just being a good product person, which was just, again, like, whose problem am I trying to solve? And not just sort of asking people like, what do they need? Because sometimes the customer doesn't know what they need. Yeah. And there's this real art and science of, building something that's just ahead of what they're sort of looking for. And the challenge is not going too far ahead. And we built some of those, like where we were like years ahead of where we needed to be, because, we built a mobile game on flip phones, to get kids going around different places. And then iPhone comes out, and then all of a sudden, when I see this like Pokemon game, it's like, oh yeah, like if we had that 5 years ago, that would be great technology. So you just sort of like never know. So, I think to me, like the transition was just embracing that sort of product side of me. Even the word entrepreneur, I don't identify with that so much necessarily, because it has just been moving from project to project, or product to product, or brand to brand, right? Just start something, build a team, get it out there, either grow it, hand it off, or then move on to the next thing, right? And that's what when I look back at sort of like my career of stuff, it's just been like, 100 of those kind of like projects and products along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's well, it's an interesting way to look at it. And uh, yeah, are they projects? Are they businesses? Are they a mix of in between? Are they, but
Yeah.
but it does come down to the essence of, I'm still going to use the term entrepreneur, but it's, or someone that just loves to build,
Yeah.
build. And I know actually early in my career, I know there's a sort of a mentor of mine, or one of my advisors during my master's degree, that he just sort of told me one day that I think I was, at that point I started rolling around in my head, should I be looking at a PhD? And I'm not, like, I am not cut out for that. I know that now. I'm like, that would have been a bad idea. And he just looked at me and goes, you just like to build things. And at that time I was kind of like, oh, that's kind of a jerk thing to say, but now I look back and I'm like, no, I love building things. And there's something to that. And it was such a good observation and an important one, because you have to find that, that thing that drives you, and that you get some, self-worth out of, and
Yeah.
really enjoy. Right.
Well, I think that's like the one, sort of the traits of I think good entrepreneurs are, and one of the main ones is having enough self-awareness, right? And knowing who you are, not just what you're good at or not, but also what you're willing to sort of push, and where you need to sort of learn, or where you need to surround yourself with the right mentors, or when you're sort of like building a team, sort of figuring out, it all sort of really kind of stems from you as like, the entrepreneur. And that's why I always sort of feel like, entrepreneurship is more than just running a business. And yet, people, it sort of immediately equate, entrepreneur to business owner. And I think when you think about the building mentality, I'm just like, that is what entrepreneurship to me is all about, is figuring out what to build, and, what do you need to sort of build around you to make that thing happen.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I wholeheartedly agree that entrepreneur to me is someone that builds product, builds business, builds, like, just builds. I would say in the past, I was a business owner, but I
Right.
don't know if I was an entrepreneur. And now I feel like it's about building and changing the world, not just sort of serving customers, our clients, I suppose. It's a bit of a mental thing for me. It's just, it's how everyone sees what they're interested in, what they're passionate about. So how did you move into this space of, I guess, what were some of the projects? How did you move from this space where you're doing educational materials to starting this journey to where you are today?
Yeah. So I would say there's been kind of what I call 3 acts so far. So, in that sort of first act, there was, a couple of ventures. So, there's so Rocket Fuel, the games company, when we start to build our own stuff and build stuff outside of our market, which is a really interesting thing. And, that really kind of had come from this very first company called Hot Rocket, right? Which was actually called Shark Tank. Like, so there's just different iterations of what this agency, when you're an agency, you're kind of always sort of thinking about its brand and what you're working on and all that type of stuff. But I call that basically the, like, digital media phase. And building those kind of companies, one of the things that really then started to like emerge was building those companies from our community. So, we're based in Edmonton, and we were doing a lot of business outside of Edmonton, and people would always be like, oh, you're based in Edmonton, they would immediately think either like Toronto or Vancouver, especially because we were in like entertainment media kind of stuff. Not Edmonton, and so spending a lot of time, and this is where I've always sort of said, I think it's good to have the outside perspective in terms of also getting out of the echo chamber of your like local entrepreneur community too. Because you want to get the right feedback kind of along the way. And you don't want someone to just pump your entrepreneur tires and be like, that's awesome, but you're not actually getting the kind of feedback that you need to necessarily get at the pace that you need it in your own backyard. And so sort of spending time outside the city was then kind of coming back and being like, well, what is the problem? The solution shouldn't just be, should I stay or should I move to another market? right? In Edmonton or, you know, Alberta. And so I started to get involved in things. So like we were both part of like Digital Alberta and, you know, the industry associations and, you know, getting around the table of those. You know, and this is where your whole ecosystem, innovation ecosystem starts to come into play. So that's really where this sort of next wave of things with Startup Edmonton kind of came out of, which was, you know, not just being the builders of companies, but how do I create the environment for companies and other entrepreneurs like myself, selfishly, because I just wanted to be around more companies and more entrepreneurs in my own backyard who are thinking the same way. And then the second is, how do you actually make that happen in a city, you know, where it's not up to government, you know, where it's not up to sort of like, you know, any one player. It's kind of this community of sort of people, which to me kind of harkens a little bit back again to the education side, which is when I think about cities is like, you know, it's like a big classroom, you know, like how can we kind of create more of the conditions that more entrepreneurs want to sort of step out and try something and build something from here. And that's how Startup Edmonton came to be. And, you know, sort of spent some time in that, you know, building, you know, being entrepreneurial, creating a venture that was built to build other ventures, right? And became the incubator. Like I know I was a company that went through a bunch of these other incubation programs, you know, and in our early days of Startup Edmonton, it was like, we just wanted to build the clubhouse, which is where you just come in and build stuff. It doesn't matter if you're a student or if you are, you know, 3-time entrepreneur or you are like retired and you want to kind of come build something, like come and build around some other people. So that's what that sort of like wave was about. And then today, you know, I feel that that's kind of what led to Makespace, you know, which was, so Startup Edmonton, just kind of quick background, you know, we developed this thing as a nonprofit to start, as a volunteer oriented thing. And then it turns into a company on its own, you know, and here we are again, growing a team, building out a space, building this platform and this product, right?
Well, let's not make that quick because it's your act 2 and it's really interesting. I still remember. What year did you have Startup Edmonton when it was still that hadn't even been renoed yet? It was where you started it.
First Startup Edmonton stuff was like 2009. So that was like
2009.
And then we moved into the space in 2011, 2012.
Okay. So, you know, I remember 2009 really well. I always credit, that's where Dryrun comes from, because I learned all about cash flow around that time. And so, but I wanted to paint a little picture for people that, like you mentioned, kind of this clubhouse for entrepreneurs sort of thing. I'm still, Edmonton at that time, and there's been a lot of activity since that time, but you were one of the spearheads, I think, to the city really starting to get some activity going. And I wanted to sort of describe to people when, I think it probably was around 2009, I was invited to, I'm assuming by you, as a press conference or something where you were announcing what you're going to do. And, you know, so we go downtown and check it out. And to describe it to you guys, it was like a big old warehouse, really just an absolutely amazing space. But at that time, it was just a warehouse. And we went up to the top floor, and it was, you know, wood floors, dusty, dirty brick, and dangerous. Yeah. And there was, I don't even know if I don't recall anything else. You probably remember, but I don't even remember anything else in the building. It was just kind of at the end of this lonely street across from a casino. Right. Yeah. And somehow, like, and to your credit and your partner's credits and that, just within a few years, this was an absolute innovation hub for Edmonton. The space had absolutely been transformed. The building had absolutely been transformed. And I think it actually turned into an anchor for transforming what is now one of the most interesting and sort of special streets in downtown Edmonton. And this was, again, like, it was almost a landmark there. And now across the street where the casino used to be is now, like, you know, Rogers Place, the home of the Oilers, and we've got 2 big towers, and the downtown is transformed. But in 2009, we're in like the recession, and to sort of, I just wanted you to, like, paint a bit of a picture of how you got something that was much more ambitious than you're describing, and was much more of a centerpiece for the city. How you got that off the ground in a time that was impossible to get anything off the ground.
Right. Yeah, and you kind of always sort of chalk it up to just being naive about what you should do and how you should, how do you sort of build something. And the term like innovation ecosystem is one of those like, very, politicized, over architected sort of thing, because every city wants like, hot tech talent, innovation, like that's what they want for their city. But it's one thing to sort of say that, but it's another thing to actually like make that happen. And understanding to what scale do you, where does it actually sort of come from? And to me, innovation really comes from the people, and it comes from this intersection of like people and technology now trying to sort of, come up with new ways to solve problems in different ways too. And what that sort of takes is just, again, creating the right type of environment to encourage that to happen. And having been a client of a lot of the other incubators, and a lot of the sort of established incubators in town too, right? Like these are, funded up incubators, different kind of types of models, some tied to universities, some that were more independent. And there was value sort of learned from each one of those things. But, in the world of sort of ecosystem building, there's this term that was always used, which is client. And it was just like, and it was about service delivery, and so each incubator would have like their clients, right? And the reality is, it's like, look, an entrepreneur is going to build whatever they want,
Yeah.
and who they're going to build it with, right? And so the first thing is really, can all the builders just be next to each other or connect with each other? So then they know that as they're each grinding it out, and entrepreneurship is a really lonely thing. It is hard to be a solo entrepreneur. I've always had a co-founder too, which is sort of helped, but there's so much value in just having other people around you that are also just there. Again, we go back to this like support thing we were talking about at the beginning. That sort of like support network is really key. And that's, to me, is where great sort of startup communities arise from. And so the problem at that stage in time was everyone was talking about how we needed more entrepreneurs to sort of like make things happen, diversify the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just like, but what are you guys doing to actually make that happen? And what these people need isn't more infrastructure, it's just each other. That's the first thing. And so those early days of startup was actually not even about a place. It was about just creating opportunities to gather the builders in the community, right? So things like demo camp, we would do things like startup weekend. We were deploying stuff that we'd see in other cities. Like, and again, this is going through that process, meeting other entrepreneurs out there, and now applying all of that in our own backyard. Just the act of organizing a meetup, I think, is one of the greatest things that's, that happens in cities, because, the ability to organize. Before, you would need to create an industry association, then you got to set up a board, and then you need funding, and then then you're advocating for an industry, versus, hey, you want to start a meetup for like other robotics people? Awesome. Here's a place, get some pizza, just start bringing some people together. And that's really what it's about. So startup to us was always about creating that sort of that platform to organize and gather. And then enough of a brand around it too. So there's the art part, which is you want people to believe in something and sort of get behind something, right? And so there's this like, we had this like 500 entrepreneurs in 5 years was kind of how we like kind of came out. And it was just like, why 500, right? And why didn't we say companies? And I said, well, to me, 500 entrepreneurs in 5 years, those 500 entrepreneurs are each going to start like 5 to 10 things. And they're all going to know each other, and they're all going to be part of this pack, and see what happens out of that in 5 to 10 years, And I think that that's kind of why we had success in those early days, because we were removing the hierarchy of entrepreneurship and starting companies. Sometimes it's hard for people to be like, I don't know business, and or I don't know how to read a balance sheet, or I've not done this before, so I'm going to wait until I have the most perfect idea to start something, and they just never do. And I think for people, Startup Edmonton was the sort of just the place and the group and the community that they could go and take those first steps and just explore what they wanted to do.
Well, I think, as I watched you like kind of build this Startup Edmonton up, and then, suddenly I'm getting emails all the time, and there's another another event and another interesting thing. And sometimes I was there getting, talking with someone and getting some advice or some coaching or whatever it is. And other times I was doing the opposite and helping someone else along. And most times it was both in the same time. Right.
Right.
And I think that you guys sort of hit on something that you drove activity. There was always something going on, and it wasn't, hey, come sit in a boring lecture. Like I remember in digital Alberta days, there were a few, come out and hang out in a boring lecture. But this was it was community. It was definitely community building. And it was, and of course, building with these that would be a lot of them your future colleagues and in an entrepreneurial spirit. But also the thing that helped pull that together was this cool place to meet, right? Like it was, you have all these events, but then you got to this sort of anchor point and you kind of knew where to go. And there was always something going on there. There's always a lot of activity, a lot of people around there. And it felt like the city livened up around it.
Yeah.
Which I thought was so interesting.
And I think that's kind of like, one of the biggest things about being a, community organizer, or, what we were sort of doing. It's like, it's really always about build like momentum. Like, when I think about Startup Edmonton, to me, that was like a product in itself. And in fact, it was like, product that sort of then started to turn into this platform to do what we were sort of doing, right? Because when these things really start to go, it's because people sort of see value to build on top of it, right? So it's just like, well, we had to organize a lot of the early stuff. But then we deliberately, when we got the space, part of the thinking was like, well, we're building a space so other people can go and organize all the meetups and stuff and we're going to remove the friction and the barriers for them to have to try to find space to organize, try to sort of find an audience, et cetera, and just be like, come build with Startup Edmonton. And then all of a sudden, and this is this thing of just no hierarchy, right? Like, it was, well, then we had now more of these leaders in the community starting to just organize stuff. But we were also doing it next to each other. And that to me is when it really starts to become something. And I think it was interesting then sort of seeing what was the next stage of growth for Startup Edmonton. Because just like, in those early days, it's just like, well, what is this thing now? Like, we've now become this organization or the entity that we were not kind of, thinking we were going to be. It has become now, something that from a city perspective, or it's like an institution in that sort of sense, right? And so it started to then push on, well, what is the next thing for this? And, and there was a point where we said Startup Edmonton was only going to just be 5 years. Like we were just going to build it. And then the next stuff, we can kind of like step out, and then the next stuff starts building, because you assume that the community continues to evolve. Like that's how it should go. But in a lot of cities, it goes like this, right? It kind of just, it restarts every single time. And in small, mid-sized cities like ours, like Edmonton's not that big, right? It's like 1 million people or so, but it's not that big. So if we keep starting, we're never getting to that like next level. Yeah. But when things get very like, again, politicized, or, you start to over-architect what this thing needs to be, and then it sort of says, well, we need to scale that up. And it's like, well, what does that mean in terms of scaling up entrepreneur? Like, well, we need to focus on like larger companies, like scale ups instead of, but to me, it's not an either or. Like I said, we were building the farm team. If you want NHL teams, you need to have a really great farm system of talent to be moving up the chain. But we can't attack the entire thing. We were just going to sort of focus on that sort of that startup entrepreneur mentality, and keep that going for years, right? And figure out how do we actually sort of like, keep that going, and what's the engine that needs to make that happen.
And there's always, powers that be that want a shortcut. They think there's a shortcut, and you hit the nail on the head. Like you have to have this thriving community of not even startups. Sometimes it's just budding entrepreneurs with a bit of an idea. And all the way up, and it just keeps feeding and growing. And no, you can't just suddenly replace the. It's like cutting the feet off at the bottom. You just can't replace that and think that the community is going to keep going, right?
Yeah, and you have to kind of nurture it, just like like if you think about your customer base too, like they're going to constantly look for, well, what is the value that's there? Because there's always going to be new stuff that sort of pops out there, and you can never really take that for granted. Even when it comes to city building and community building. And I think that that's what happens a lot of time. Like, if you get too caught up in, localized sort of championing for the sake of championing, but you're not actually evolving what's going on, that doesn't actually sort of help the community grow. Right.
Yeah.
And so you don't want to pump tires where it's not sort of meant to be, or you create an even more of an echo chamber around this sort of small stage, entrepreneurs. That's what I really like about where the community has actually sort of gone, because I think startup was sort of that first sort of those initial sort of steps to break out of that, to put some like newer voice on the table. And what's awesome is there are like larger companies that are growing here. There is more venture capital that's kind of coming into the market. Like there's just a more of this sort of embrace that it's not up to anybody else to try to make that happen. And so you've now had some sort of like, more players kind of stepping out of just trying to build community stuff. Cause I think we're good when it comes to community stuff. And then you need that sort of next layer. And then you need coordination now with that layer. Right. And so it then becomes about, well, what is the next, like, when do you now need more capital, more infrastructure, and whose job is it to do that? And, our story with Startup Edmonton, hasn't ended, because, when we were acquired by economic development, sort of spent some time there, like, for me was then looking after like the ecosystem as a whole, like including the research park, the other incubators, et cetera. And thinking about, again, this ecosystem building. The challenge is that, now we're inside the city or sort of economic development, and, the metrics that are there are very different than trying to sort of build that sort of community part. And so, it's been interesting to sort of see where startup kind of continues to evolve, which has been great. There's more players on the ground, which is awesome. And there's new things that are starting to kind of rise up. And this sort of next thing to me is about like the next wave of infrastructure building, which is kind of where Makespace has kind of come from. So, kind of building this sort of phase 3 company or act 3 company is very much about how do you do, city building and ecosystem building when it comes to development, real estate, capital, and create platforms to sort of make that happen, right? And so when you think about like space is just space. Like, it's like a commodity. It's what you do with that space that makes it more valuable. Yeah. And, having now spent like a few years in this world of, again, like real estate, I'm not a real estate guy. So there's always this theme, just like, I don't really know how city building is supposed to work. I don't know how economic development is supposed to work, but I know it comes back to who's the user there, and what are their sort of challenges, and sort of you kind of come to that. And this world of real estate today is really interesting because you have all of this capital and all of this infrastructure that is sort of built around cities and buildings. And today we're so connected that do we even need those things? You can build awesome companies from anywhere, and we have the internet, right? We can connect with customers from anywhere. And so the value proposition of place and space to entrepreneurs is this really interesting thing that's evolved really quickly now. It was on this path already. I don't think it's sort of like reverted because of the pandemic, but it's actually accelerated where the world is going. And now, the owners of real estate and cities, the way that those things were working is breaking down really quickly because they can't rely on sort of like old ways of, measuring value, performance. You can't do 15-year development plans around city because it's like, what's the world going to be like in 15 years, Yeah. But the people are building right now. And you can build something from your own backyard. How do we still support those entrepreneurs from any city?
So tell me a little bit about like kind of given sort of the big picture, but what are you doing today with Makespace? Like, tell me a bit about like a case study or a project or whatever to help paint the picture of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so I think, Makespace has been interesting. So, myself and my partners have all kind of come from, one has come from like agency, sort of like brand and creative. Another has come from hospitality. Another one has come from building franchise brands, right? And so part of this has been like, okay, well, how can we build a different kind of development company that looks at, again, real estate and place and is really working with, so we work with both private owners of spaces who are thinking about like, not just what do we do with our space or how do we activate our space, but how do we actually create more value around our space? You know, because you can't just, it's not just about leasing to 1,000 people anymore. People need less space. They even need the space in general, you know, or it's not even, or we work with the operators of, you know, you can't just be a restaurant because you can't just rely on foot traffic anymore. You have to be more of a culinary brand. And so it's this sort of like brand, you know, experience and physical space and this sort of connection sort of between, right? Like we're not an architecture firm. We're not a real estate broker. We're sort of right in the middle here. And I think it's because having this background in, you know, innovation ecosystems and product development and all that type of stuff, it's like, that's kind of what the game is today, which is people want those people in their buildings and in their cities.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but it takes more than putting a slick brand on a building, you know, or doing a placemaking strategy and being like, we're a tech city. It's just like, well, every city is a tech city. Every business is a tech business today too, you know, and you can only add so many features to your buildings to make it more Google-like, because every building is going to have that too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we as a company, you know, have, like, when I think about Makespace, the goal is build a portfolio of brands and a network of spaces. And so the idea there is, you know, when you start to create a network of spaces, it's really about what do people, the users of space, need, and where do they need it from. So, you know, it's not just about building, you know, an innovation hub. It's really about a network of spaces that entrepreneurs can be able to tap into in a city. We're working on a project right now called The Public, which is all about food entrepreneurs and food makers. But, you know, the idea of, you know, the food hub, or like, you know, just a localized food community, to me, it's really about how can you, you know, scale up local supply chains to help grow these brands to have customers outside of the city, right? And that means scaling up some more infrastructure. And, you know, food companies need more than just computers and internet. You know, in this case, they need shared kitchens, they might need warehouse space, they might need distribution. And you can't build all of that in one place, but you can build it across a network of stuff too. So that's really what we're sort of working to build. And then the portfolio of brands really kind of comes into working with other entrepreneurs to build new brands and things to put into these spaces. Right. And so sometimes they're like incubator style brands. Sometimes it's like, you know, an operating brand or something. But, you know, if we can kind of solve the problem of just creating a portfolio space that we can then get the right mix of stuff happening there, that creates more value for the owners of those buildings, and it creates more value for those areas and neighborhoods. So the one main platform and project that we're working on right now is called 1M, or 1 million feet. And it kind of came out of working on stuff in downtown Calgary. So we had been engaged to help develop this new innovation hub in the East Village called Platform. And it was a 50,000 foot sort of innovation hub. It was next to the new library, and it was a neighborhood sort of centric one. And it's just like, and we've done those projects, you know, we've done maker spaces, food hubs, et cetera. But it was interesting working on that because in downtown Calgary, a lot of the narrative was around 13 million feet of vacant office space, right? And so, and especially now where it's just like people aren't even in the offices anymore, right? And it's like, well, you can't solve, there's not gonna be one big solution to sort of solving that problem. To me, it's just like, it's like hundreds of little solutions that starts to be, you know, starts to add up to sort of something. Yeah. And so we said, well, what can we do with 1 million feet and from the ground up? And so what we said was, well, how could we build this platform that would create opportunities for people that are trying to solve these solutions using space and place to experiment and sort of test those things out in a very focused area, which is then 1 million feet in terms of footprint and volume of space. And so we're doing this in downtown Calgary right now, launching this fall. And the pandemic has actually kind of created more opportunities now also in other cities, because everybody's thinking right now about main streets, downtowns. And when you think about these micro neighborhoods, it's really about the businesses that are in the areas that provide those services. So these are like the restaurants, the small businesses, et cetera. And then you have the users who are the tenants who work and live in these buildings. Those are the only two players who need to connect to each other. Everybody else, landlords, cities, et cetera, is just a player to enable that to happen. And so that's a big part of just, again, flipping that around and being like, if we can create a better connection at that sort of hyper local level, for these creators and consumers in an area, you're going to start to see more stuff kind of coming out of that too. So that's what we're working on right now. This is 1M.
So it's still at a fundamental level. You still seem to be able to cut through the muck and know it's about building community. It's about building relationships. It's about facilitating and bringing people together. And it's such a massive shift from sort of the old price per square foot.
Yeah.
That's, and is it class A, whatever
is
that
it
is, right?
Exactly. Yeah. There's real estate. There's so much hierarchy, right? And when you think about just pricing, like the problem in a lot of areas is you have 15 different owners on the same block, but they've all priced their stuff based on market. And it's just like, well, but now it's not about the cost or price of that space, it's the value of what happens there. And so I think it's why it's actually the best time right now, because it's really exposed a lot of, the old ways of thinking that actually need to be fixed, right? Mm-hmm. So how performance, how ROI is created, right? And so in real estate right now, there's this thing of like tenant experience and the value of that. And it's like, but each landlord you sort of talk to values experience in a very different way. Or how do you price experience, right, for them? And, for some people, they're like, well, we just need to find a cool coffee shop operator and just put them in the lobby, but I argue that coffee shops have been doing placemaking for free in cities for landlords in cities for years. And now they don't have the benefit of foot traffic, and then their model sort of breaks down too. So it's this like totally like, integrated sort of like system. And so you have to kind of cut through the hierarchy of how real estate is sort of like developed now too. I think for cities, we're also seeing, there's going to be a lot of like change of use, right? Now, how many times have we sort of heard someone complain about the city when they're like, we just wanted to do a patio, or we just wanted to do like a small thing. And, those worlds are built around, rules and creating like systems instead of just maximizing freedom and speed. And like, again, it goes back to product mentality. Go out there, figure it out. I'd rather 8 out of 10 people tell me that they don't want that or that doesn't actually make sense, and then we just move on to the next thing. But instead, city building and real estate is very, because it has to be kind of long range. Like, and so how do you do startup style city development? And that to me is kind of what the new opportunity is right now in a lot of cities.
And the last thing I sort of wanted to touch on that I'm kind of curious about is, like, I remember, over, I've known you for a long time, and I've seen and watched and heard several people say, Ken gets stuff done because he apologizes after. I don't know if you've heard that, but it's really tricky to get how, like, when you're working with cities, and is there anything more bureaucratic than government? And so how have you been able to transition and navigate sort of red tape and just systems that are so slow to move and so overbuilt over many, many years? How have you been able to navigate that and actually get like 1 million going? Like how some insight there on how you do that?
Yeah. So I think it's sort of, it's always sort of stemmed back to this sort of understanding when you kind of bring it down to the people level, right? So if we sort of take the systems and the labels out, right? It's just like government is bad, is good or bad. Private sector, they just, like private developers just want to make money. It's just like, well, yeah, because that's the math that needs to work. So you have to have hope and math work together. And I think in a lot of cities, they either go too heavy on the hope, or they go too heavy on the math, and they don't realize that real people live in their cities who are kind of constantly evolving. And what every city has now is connectivity to other cities. Like, we as people can connect with people in other places. And so I think the shift to sort of, sort of moved from like, whose job is it to solve X problem, right? So whose job is it to do placemaking? It isn't up to the city. They're a player. Like, everybody has to sort of be a player. So I think why it's sort of for me has been a lot of like just being naive about, I don't know how it works. So, but I learn enough from it. And so it kind of comes back to like, if I don't know, I'm going to try to figure it out. And I also at the same time, it's this empathy piece, which is knowing what somebody else is sort of like kind of coming at it from too. And I think that's why it worked too with like Startup Edmonton, right? Like it's because we were really focused on like other entrepreneurs like ourselves and being like, what is their actual problem? I would get into debates with people who were running entrepreneurship programs. And I said, how many times have you not been able to make payroll? Like you've never had that feeling. And so how can you possibly sort of understand what that person is sort of going through and build a program for them, or provide them with the right mentorship? And so, this sort of having been now on the inside and just understanding there's really great people in government, there's really great people who are trying to sort of make stuff happen sort of like within, but it is this like really, bureaucratic sort of system. And so you lose a lot of really good people inside these like big organizations who are trying to make stuff happen, and this is the whole innovation, thing in big companies is how do you unlock the people who are committed and who understand the process of, say, government, right? And then who can then start to kind of push on specific, because then they know where the cracks are. The hardest thing for someone on the outside is being like, well, what cracks do we hit? Because I can't hit all of them. And I'm not going to run for council, or I'm not going to run for being like the mayor or whatever, right? And I know that about myself, but I know I need to find allies in private sector at all levels, in government, in my community. And then you just rally those allies towards something. And to me, it's I think that's why being like a politician is actually really hard, because, it's very much about getting the sort of the majority, vote or the consensus building. And it's like, I'm not a consensus builder. I'm rather be one of those people that like put something out there. And there's been a lot of stuff that hasn't worked too, for sure. Right. But, like I know how it feels and I learn from each one. And, and so when you think about hundreds of projects over the years, or these 20 years or so, I've learned something from every single one of those things. And so anytime a new conversation sort of comes up, I know how they're kind of coming at it from, understanding what's their goals, right? And then figuring out how do these things work together. And then I think the third piece is, so it's like being naive, having that empathy for the other person, or the customer empathy. And then the third one is just straight up courage, which is putting something out there and just being okay that it's probably gonna fail, or someone's gonna write something bad about it, or be like, what is he talking about? And that's okay, right? That's just part of it. And so you just start developing a little bit of like it's not even about building like a thicker skin, so you're ignoring it. Like one of the things about entrepreneurship, I think, is being able to understand what signals you need to sort of chase, and then what's noise.
Yeah.
Right. And you think about that from like mentors that you get for like getting feedback from people. You pitch something out there and then just random people are giving you feedback about your pitch, right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, if these sort of thoughts, so the best entrepreneurs are the ones that can kind of take all those different data points and sort of figure out what's the ones that they actually need to keep going or move on to the next thing.
Yeah. I'm on that note, and I think the quote of the day was that both hope and math have to work. And I thought that was a really good. You can get to make T-shirts on that, man.
That's right. I have a Venn diagram of that. It's like
nice. That's trademark that one. No, it's really insightful, and it's I've always admired all the things that you've come up with, and your dogged determination, and your way to just get things done that with big things that seemed that they're almost against insurmountable odds, but they never are. You just seem to be able to build bigger and bigger and bigger things. And I'm looking forward to once we can get out and about, checking out the 1 million feet downtown Calgary, and sit across the street from it, have a beer, and
that's right.
Check it out.
That's right. It's coming back. Yeah, no, totally. It's like it's not a if things are coming back or when things are coming back, but I think how people are coming back. And I think, what's interesting is just the world of work and building stuff, and even like the hard lines between being, again, an entrepreneur versus a community builder. Like, to me, that line is blurred. Like anybody can be an entrepreneur. It's about being able to just make stuff happen, but you start small and then they just start adding up into bigger things. So no, I'm excited to, kind of get things going. And I mean, even for us, just learning from, each other around kind of how we've sort of started companies and stuff has been really valuable. So this is great.
Well, this is such a great conversation. I was really, I was looking forward to this one, and hopefully it won't, I know we're in a pretty far north here, but hopefully it won't be too long where we can get outside on the deck again in the social distance world here and catch up in person. But I really appreciate your time, Ken. Thanks so much for joining me. And if anyone wanted to check out what you're doing at Makespace, how do they find you?
I just go to makespacegroup.com, and then we've got
makespacegroup.com. Yeah. Okay. And we will try to remember to put that in the notes. We always forget about that stuff, but we'll get it in there. And as always, everyone, I'm CEO at Dryrun. We deal with cash flow management. And if you're dealing with some cash flow issues right now and you want some help with that, please check us out at dryrun.com. We would be happy to help. Thanks, Ken, for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.